Hello everyone, welcome back to another G Lemons video. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the input shaft bearings on a 2004 to 2010 5-speed Suzuki Swift. In this case the gearbox is mounted to a 1.3 petrol engine. These cars also came with a 1.5 I believe. I imagine the process is very similar, although the internals may look slightly different. As you can see from the video, you then want to remove the casing off of the side of the gearbox. Simply undo the bolts securing the casing to the housing, and then using a utility knife you can split the silicone gasket material securing the two parts together. From here you'll need to remove the large nut from the shaft. This nut is pinned into a keyway to stop it coming loose, and as you'll see, mine put up quite a fight when I was trying to remove it. You want to be really careful not to damage the threads too much when you remove this. I damaged mine slightly, but it wasn't bad enough that I needed to get any machine work or re-tap the threads or anything silly. As you can see, I made quite a mess of this. From here you want to take a punch and knock out the split pin holding in this sub-assembly. You then want to take a set of circlip pliers, carefully remove the circlip from the shaft. This is your input shaft, this one. You then remove this little cap. And then the whole sub-assembly should pull off in one. There you go. I take a picture of how this assembly goes together, because it will help when you come to put it back together. You then want to remove this retaining plate. This plate holds down the bearings that we're going to replace, or at least one of them. The large one on the right is one of the input shaft bearings, and you'll see on top of it there's a needle bearing and a spacer. This ends up being quite the pain to remove. This was definitely the hardest part of the job. I ended up giving it to my brother to do, but I'll show you how he removed it later on in the video. For now, that's as far as we can go on that side of the gearbox, so you need to move onto the top of the gearbox and remove the gear selector assembly. There's 4 bolts. One of them slightly awkward. Use a spanner and you'll be able to get to it. It's kind of hidden below the linkage. There it is. Awkward little thing. With that out of the way, you can move on to the rear of the gearbox. Now, this is the rear of the gearbox when it's installed into the car. From there, you can remove a bolt and a retaining pin, which after shifting the assembly into neutral will allow you to remove the shift assembly. Here you can see when the gearbox is and isn't in neutral. You'll know you're in neutral when you can press on top of the assembly and the shaft running through the centre will depress and spring back from within the gearbox. With the gear selector assembly removed, you can work your way around the outside of the gearbox and remove the bolts that fasten the 2 gearbox casings together. As you can see, I've just flipped the gearbox over, and that's to remove 2 bolts that are inside the bell housing that affix the 2 casings together from the other side. Again, I'm carefully using a utility knife to split the silicone between the 2 housings. So once you're done hitting it with a hammer and trying to pry it apart with a screwdriver, you can spin the gearbox around and undo this bolt. Once you undo this, you can then split the 2 halves of the gearbox casing. Woo. This bearing ended up being the culprit of the noise from the gearbox. So you can see as I'm moving it around, there's quite a bit of play in that bearing. When the car was running and the clutch was up, you could hear a noise. It was kind of like the sea when you hear when you hold a shell up to your ear, it was like shh. That's what it sounded like. Once you depressed the clutch, the noise would stop. But the play in the bearing here was the cause of that noise. Ultimately, that's why I ended up taking the gearbox apart. So there you can see I've removed the reverse gear assembly. There we go, pop that out. And then what you want to do is undo these 3 bolts here, and they secure a spring and a ball detent that engages with the shaft of the fork selectors. And then after that, you'll be able to pull out the shift fork assemblies. So from left to right, if you orientate yourself with the gearbox in the same way it is in the video, this is how you want to reinstall the springs.
Hell yeah.
Here's the part number for the other bearing I replaced on the opposite end of the input shaft.
Finally.
So here you can see me trying to remove the bearing in the sleeve. I was using a cheap Chinese bearing puller and it didn't work at all, so I wouldn't advise doing it this way. I would follow the steps in the next clip I'm about to show you. Okay, so I'm going to try and make this obvious. Might be a bit tricky, but what we've got here is the red is your shaft. This is your input shaft. The green is the sleeve that goes over the input shaft, and the blue is the bearing that we're going to replace. So as you can see from the video, it was quite difficult to remove. So what I didn't do this myself because I couldn't get it off. I mashed up a couple of bearing pullers, trying to pull the bearing and the sleeve off in one go. That didn't work. So I gave it to my brother. He's a truck mechanic, general meathead, so I knew he could get it off. And what he did was he ground down the top of this sleeve, so just one side of it. He ground it down until he could see the shaft poking through, and then hit this corner with a cold chisel. And because this metal is really tough, really hard, it's really brittle, and once he'd ground this down thin enough, once he hit it with a cold chisel, the sleeve split open and popped off of the shaft. And then from there, he was able to just cut up the bearing and remove that. Right, this thing's just come out of the freezer, so hopefully it will let me get the bearing on a bit easier. So here I'm putting the larger of the 2 bearings onto the input shaft. I've had the input shaft assembly in the freezer for a few days. If you didn't know, as things get colder, they shrink, and as they get hotter, they expand, especially in metals. So by putting the input shaft assembly in the freezer, we're shrinking it so that the fit between the bearing and the input shaft is looser. And then as the parts warm back up, it will all equalise and the bearing will be a nice tight fit. Right, what I've done is I've 3D printed this little thing. It sits over the top, and hopefully I can just back this into position. Fucking perfect. And then I've got to do the same for the sleeve. And that's perfect. Fucking hell. This has taken weeks, this part of the job. So with that bearing and the spacer reinstalled on the input shaft, it's time to reassemble the gearbox. The next few clips I'm not going to talk over, as you can see exactly what I'm doing, largely the inverse of taking it apart. Is that the right way to do that? My bearing here is sat a bit proud, so I'm going to have to knock that down. Use a punch. I don't think the diff's seated where it should be, so there we go. I don't think the video makes it very clear what's happening here. From left to right, what you want to do is put in a small spring, big spring, small spring. Before you put the springs in, make sure you put the ball bearing in. So it goes ball bearing, spring, bolt, small spring, big spring, small spring. That's what you got to remember. Hopefully you can see the mark on top of this reverse gear. What you want to do is make sure you line this. I'm using just a bolt. I think this is for the outer casing, but it's the same thread pitch. What you want to do is line this mark up with this bolt hole here. And then when you put the other casing on, your bolt should line up through the side of the casing to hold this reverse gear pin, whatever you want to call it, in place. Right, it's time to lay the bead of sealant. I'm just wiping the surface with acetone. Sorry, not acetone, isopropyl alcohol. I said propanol. Oh shit. Oh well. Let's get this shit on. Got to put enough squish out. I don't think you can. Let's get this flipped over and quickly do the ones on the inside. These two. Right, that's that. Now we're going to leave that 5 minutes, let the silicone set up a little bit. That's what it says on the back of the box. Allow drying for an hour,
I'll then tighten the bolts. For an hour. I'm not doing that. I'll probably wait like 20 minutes. And then we'll tighten the bolts all the way, and that allows the silicone to cure, but not fully. So when you finally compress it, it provides a better seal.
So before we can put the shift assembly back in, you want to make sure these 3 forks are aligned. You can see it's a bit hard. I was struggling here. Shaking, quivering in me boots. But get them all aligned, and then the shift assembly can slide in.
This would usually have a paper gasket, but mine's broken, so I'm just going to replace it with silicone. I don't think it really matters. Is it sealed? Right, what you want to grab is these 2 little weird looking bolts. Right in the way. Yeah. So this one here, with the little pin on the end, goes in the top one, and this goes in the bottom one, like so. Right, let's tighten these top ones first, because it seemed to shift. Right, this is the bolt for the reverse gear. If you've done it right, you should have lined up the threaded section of that pin with the hole by lining the mark up on the top with this bolt hole. Right, so I don't know what I've shown in the video, because I recorded this like a week ago, but I've realised I've assembled this wrong. So this bearing race here, this is a what's it called? It's a needle bearing, but it's tapered. This little spacer, I didn't show this in the video, but this little spacer needs to sit on top of here. There you go, to hold this race down. The shim on the spacer should be flush with the top of the box here. And if it's not, if the race is sitting proud, you can just grab a little punch and just hit down on the edges of this. I think what happens is when you put this shaft in from the other side, when you put the top half of this casing on top, the bearing pushes this race up. So you need this little shim to sit on top. You then get your plate. Sorry, that sits on top like that.
I don't advise you do the nut up like I have here. Instead, I'd probably buy the tool if I were to do this again that lock the gears so that I'm not putting pressure on those teeth with the grips. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it and better still learn something. I've got some K10 micro content coming soon, so look out for that. If you end up using this video as a how-to, let me know how it gets on in the comments. And if you've got any questions or anything you need to ask, just put them in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best I can. If you want to see how to reinstall the gearbox, please check out my clutch replacement video. It's going to be pinned in the end card of this video. Nice one. Cheers all. See you later.